Yes, thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to be looking at the leadership question. This, of course, as we are going into an election year, 2023. And as you all know, we have been in this democratic journey since 1999, which means we've been at it now for over 20 years. So is it not time for us to be getting better? Is it not time for us to be improving? And this question becomes more relevant when we consider that among our neighbors recently, we've had nothing but coup d'etat. Coup d'etat in Mali, coup d'etat in Burkina Faso, attempted coup here, attempted coup there. And what is the reason for all these coups coming up again in the 21st century? We thought we were done with them and we had all moved in the right direction of being able to elect our leaders. Well, I have said my say. Now we shall hand over to the panel, and our panel this morning is made up of Mr. John Essin, who's a lawyer and international expert on counterterrorism and conflict resolution. He joins us via Zoom from the UK. Good morning, Mr. Essin.
For having me. Good morning.
Mr. Toye Shobande is also joining us via Zoom from the UK, and he's a strategic leadership expert and also a lawyer and public speaker. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here again. Thank you.
Yes, let's start with this leadership question, because we don't want to find ourselves where our neighbors have found themselves. So we must start taking care of this leadership thing and make sure that we elect leaders who will deliver what the people want. How do you think we should begin this journey, Mr. Essin, so that in 2023, the electorate will be asking the right questions of those who put themselves forward?
Well, I think we should begin by actually defining what leadership is and see if we can put Nigeria into that context. Come to a decision as to what Nigeria is actually at the moment, because I don't think what we are running in Nigeria is a leadership. Leadership essentially involves two parties, two or more parties, with a bilateral consensus that sets out a vision at the outset and decides on a trajectory and transitional dynamics between the vision and the trajectory to move both the leadership and the electorate or the constituents to where the vision is. Now, where there's a deviation in that journey, which is usually by the leadership, because it's the leadership with the decision-making capability, where there is a deviation, then it constitutes a breach of contract. And when that happens, the constituents or the followers are not bound to that contract anymore. That is where that's where there's a problem. What Nigeria has, I would say, is a quasi-rulership, which is more of a dictatorship. But at sporadic intervals, they are leaders. At other times, they are dictators. So there's a simultaneous use of leadership and dictatorship. So we need to make these distinctions and decide where we want to be before we decide on where we are proceeding and how we are getting there.
Mr. Essen, is that to say that, okay, let me put it this way. Before we began to have the kind of leadership, actually style or form that we have now in Nigeria, we had leadership. We had our monarchies, we had our traditional institutions and all of those. So is it to say that, you know, these styles that we're looking at now, this democracy, constitutional democracy, elective positions and all, is it to say that we haven't actually aptly domesticated them in Africa, or it's just something not for us? Or I don't know, how do you put this?
It's actually the deployment. I'll use Nigeria as an example. If you look at the central institutional power at the very highest level, there is a grossly disproportionate form of representation. You have Fulanis at the very high level dominating the government. And you'll also find out that the conflict that is most prominent, from which all these other conflicts generate, are by the Fulanis, particularly Boko Haram and ISWAP. And I suspect that because there's a cultural and religious affinity, cultural and religious affinities between the government at the central institutional level and Boko Haram and ISWAP, for instance, that the government is a bit reluctant, maybe it doesn't have the political will to actually accept the punishment that is there for these groups too, because of that relationship. So it comes down to, in some respects, a personal interest in this conflict, or the people, the groups behind this conflict. That is what I think it is. It's more of a personal thing.
Mr. Shobande, you recently authored a book on what's curious for me in that title of the book is why leadership principles do not work in sub-Saharan Africa. Yes. If you can draw some points, some of those reasons alluded to in the book, to why we're having these coups and near coups in different parts of West Africa. What are we dealing with here?
Thank you very much, Mr. Makinde. I want to appreciate Mr. Essen's definition of leadership. That was very classic, and he's one of the few people that have expressed it from a leadership and a followership perspective. And like I mentioned in my book, The Leadership Myth, why leadership principles do not work in sub-Saharan Africa, is because simply we fail to put into perspective the cultural context in which those principles become applicable in our environment. Everything has to do with context. We imported a system of government from the UK. We worked with it for a while. We tried the parliamentary system. It didn't work. We threw it away. We went to pick up the presidential system in the US. We brought it here. We adopted a mode of constitution from the UK. It's not working. We threw it away. We brought in the constitutional style. We keep importing things. It's like somebody who is trying to pick pieces of other people to form his own structure. It's like you see something, if I see probably a shirt or a cloth on Mr. Essen, and Mr. Essen is probably taller than me. He has broader shoulders, and he looks so good in it. And I told my tailor, you know what, can you replicate what he's putting on? Just exactly the same size, the beauty, and let me put it on. And maybe I'm short. I'm not as tall as he is. I have short hands. I have tiny, all of those, and I get to put it on. I'm going to look like a joke. And that's exactly what is happening to us. There's a cultural context in which leadership plays out in our own environment. And when that cultural context is not put into perspective, what we have is what we are currently experiencing in terms of the fact that our system of governance is not representative enough. Leadership is representative in nature, representative based on a social contract between the led and the lead in terms of a direction. So what we have had over time is that we adopted brilliant leadership principles. We pay lip service to them. We talk about them. We do a whole lot of gymnastics around them. However, we fail to put into implementation the character, the orientation, the religious affiliation, the ethnic consciousness of the people that we are trying to impose those principles on.
But Mr. Shobande, my apologies. Isn't the cultural context and all of those things, the representation that you talked about, isn't that the attempt the federal character policy made? Try to balance the sentiments, the cultural affiliations in in the nation. I mean, using Nigeria as an example, as you said.
Thank you very much. But that is not in alignment with clear value systems. If you and I will, for any vision to work, any corporate objective, any policy in terms of the federal character to work, it has to pay credence to the culture. Why? Culture has the ability to eat vision for lunch. So no matter how fantastic that policy is, no matter how beautiful that federal character policy is, Our cultural situation is eating it up for lunch, is making a joke of it. And when we say culture, we mean the prevailing mental model, the behavioral approach of the people in charge who are responsible for the implementation. So the body language, like I spoke about the last time that I was here, the body language of those who are in rulership in this nation does not indicate any interest in those policies.
You used the word rulership.
Yes, please.
Not leadership.
I'm deliberate about the use of the word rulership because I was laughing. I was asking myself, did Mr. Esten watch us the last time we discussed on this platform? The last time we discussed on this platform, you were the one particularly who asked me to distinguish between leadership and rulership. And I mentioned for you to identify leader, for you to define a leader is different from the definition of leadership. Then it's now different from the definition of a ruler and rulership. To know that, just study the body language of a leader. The body language of a leader is that he has a sense of responsibility and purposefulness towards the fact that he owes the people he's leading, accountability.
Is that why we are having coups in West Africa?
That's why we are practically having coups in West Africa right now. Because over the time, there is a consciousness that is going around the world. People now have the ability to speak up. Technology has liberalized the ability to speak up. Technology has liberalized the ability for people to observe other communities, other nations, see what is going on there, and desire that for themselves. People now have the liberty to travel more. There are more Africans now in diaspora, going abroad, experiencing liberty, experiencing good infrastructure, experiencing development. And each time they come back home, they keep asking the same question. Why is it that our leaders travel abroad, they school abroad, they live abroad, they have their children abroad, and they cannot replicate that experience, that development in this part of our world that has resulted into that resentment? That growing resentment is not being addressed. That growing resentment is not consciously being addressed to the satisfaction of the people because the representation that they have in governance, they feel betrayed. And when people get frustrated, it's not the first time we are having a history of coup. Early, towards the end of last year, I sat down and I began to go through YouTube videos of the different coups that took place in Africa and the reasons why they took place. A lot of them, we abdicate that responsibility on the colonialists, saying that because the current government is not doing what they wanted them to do, that's why they are. That, to some extent, is true. But when you look at it, a lot of the guys who started the coups in the 60s were revolutionary in their perspective. They had revolutionary ideas. In today's political sector, how many ideologies do you see the politicians discuss that is revolutionary? Let me not even use the word revolutionary, that is transformative.
Yeah, Mr. Essen, Mr. Shabande spoke earlier about us importing our system of government. First we tried the parliamentary, and then we jettisoned it, and then we took the presidential system. But he didn't mention that in those systems, there's some kind of tutelage that the candidates go through. A man doesn't just wake up. I mean, Ayo can't just wake up tomorrow now and says he wants to be president of Nigeria. He will probably have gone from local government level, where he's local government chairman, and he goes on to be governor, and he goes on, you know, they go through some kind of training, in quotes, before they are thrown up by their parties for the highest position in the land. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. So how come we imported those systems without importing the other things that go with them that you have to do before you actually arrive at the big price?
Thank you for that question. Now, there are two components to that question, I think. The first one is, even if you import, whatever you import, you can train yourself to deploy. But where you're not honest enough, where you're not committed, where you don't have a sense of responsibility, where you're self-serving, self-indulgent, where you're opportunistic, you don't actually care about your constituents, then it doesn't matter what tutelage you have. Because if you're selfish and you're looking out for yourself, you're necessarily not going to be paying attention to those you're responsible for. And what that throws up is a deterrence by the constituents, because if you're not paying attention to them, then the only thing that keeps them aligned to that vision, whatever it is that deterrence. You lose deterrence. And when you lose deterrence as a government, it brings into question your legitimacy. And when they don't see you as legitimate, then they begin to fight, because then there's a gap there, that it needs to be plugged. They begin to fight for your position because they want that authority. They want that decision-making capability because they don't think they can afford you leading them anymore. That is what, so there are two problems. You can have all the tutelage you want, but if you do not have the hearts for the people you're leading, if you're not committed to that responsibility, then whether you're tutored or not doesn't make any difference. Because the people you're borrowing from don't have two heads. They're human beings just like you, so you can do just as well. Even though you borrowed, in some cases you can do better if you're committed. So the basic fundamental premise is the commitment. I think the tutelage actually comes after that, behind it.
You know, what you're saying now only raised one question in my mind when you talked about government, engagement and all those things. I just asked myself, so how do we throw up leaders? How do leaders come off the ranks? Earlier in the week, we were talking about something similar, and a friend, one of our guests, was telling us about how leadership is thrown up, previously, and Alero, literally quoted the man, though not using the same words, and gave the example of the UK where you are, that there was a group of leaders called the Big Four. One of them, I think, was Tony Blair, who they grew up through the ranks from the very, very local level, on and on and on and on, until they become what they until they became what they eventually became, to the top of the ladder in the country. So, how then do we raise leaders? When you talk about leadership, I just checked now and I found out that, for instance, Burkina Faso is a French-speaking country. Official language is French. Ghana is English-speaking. So it really isn't in whether or not, and it's gratifying perhaps to say, because none of you have talked about the influence of colonial masters here. You've only talked about the individuals that are involved, the individual countries that are involved here. So, because the way we are now, unless we arrest this trend, it will seem like we're just going to keep going the way we are. So, if you would give an idea, how do we raise leaders that will have an all-encompassing influence on their people, that the people will accept them for who they are, and not just for, they'll feel ostracized by the people who have become leaders?
I think the first thing to consider would be individuals who take Nigeria for what it is. Individuals who do not put their own interest as before the interest of others. Leaders who do not, who are not Fulani before they are Nigerians, who are not Igbos before they are Nigerians. Leaders who see Nigeria as a whole Nigeria, and their decisions reflect that. Okay, let's take the present government, for instance. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but I think it's worth reiterating. In a government where there's an overt demonstrable capacity to fill in just people with whom you share religious affinities, cultural affinities, where you have groups like Boko Haram and Islam doing all they're doing, and you don't address them. And another thing is the question of definition. Definitions are very important because, okay, let me just make a point about Islam. Islam is not a religion. Islam is a political movement with a religious component. And it is the most dynamic countercultural revolution of the last 20 years. And it's put Nigeria at the forefront of the global war on terror. Now, how is the government, how is the leadership addressing that? That is the most profound problem that Nigeria has at the moment. How is the leadership, in quotes, addressing that? That would tell you if what we have is a leadership, if it has the right to even be a leadership for Nigeria at the moment, or where we are.
Well, there are those who will argue with you on that one, because for many, many in this country, Islam is a religion.
Full stop.
So if there are those who are, you know, using political affiliation to it, that's another thing altogether. And well, perhaps on that you might be right. But let me take this to
question.
Yes. Let me take this to Mr. Shubande. You want to react to that?
Yes, I want to react to that.
Okay.
In the question you raised, especially with what you talked about in terms of throwing up leaders, you know, in my journey of research and discovery, when I wrote that book, Why Leadership Principles Do Not Work in Sub-Saharan Africa, some of these countries that the coups are coming up right now, I was privileged to visit those countries. And I was able to relate to what I have read in history books, what I have read in newspapers, with the environment and the situation in those countries. You talked about the fact that Ghana is English speaking, Burkina Faso is French speaking. We've not referenced the colonial, the influence of. For how long are we going to blame the colonialists for our failures? It will be responsible for an 18-year-old child who refuses to walk, and they ask him, why are you unable to walk? Why are you still crawling at 18 or at 21? And he says, oh, it's because my parents did not teach me how to walk. We cannot continue to blame. Now, that may form a part of, but we can't continue to do the blame game anymore. We've been existing for 50, 60 years. So what I'm making a point on right now is this. To develop leaders like Tony Blair, to have a system that throws up leaders from the local level down to the national level, is to have what we call a leadership development system. Nationally, as part of our national policy or as part of our orientation as a people, our approach to leadership before the colonial masters came, when they were here and after they left, in terms of our cultural process, we have a leadership development system, a grooming system. We know it as apprenticeship in the economic balance. You can reverse it into the political sector as well. Everyone who wants to become, quote and unquote, a tailor in Nigeria goes through apprenticeship.
But that happens, Mr. Shubande. It happens.
Yes,
maybe not on a large scale.
Organized.
It happens.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, is it institutionalized?
No.
It's not institutionalized. It is informal. As long as it's not that it is not there, it is there. Some of our political representatives right now grew up from that structure. It's not institutionalized for it to be of benefit to the broad population of the people, such that we know the model, we know the steps, we know the how.
So how do we institutionalize that?
That's where it becomes a national policy that starts from the local level. Look at the current policy of government on local government elections and local government participation. Nations that are serious-minded about development know that development does not start at the national level. No. You don't talk about national development. You talk about development from the grassroots. You talk about development where the government structure is closer to the people. State government, national government do not have any business with local infrastructure, with road construction, pipe-borne water. They don't. It's a waste of executive time for a governor to go and sit down and be commissioning roads and be commissioning pipe-borne waters. Those are the responsibility of the local councillors. Yeah. That is where governance goes down to the grassroots, where people learn the rudimentary process of infrastructural development, of town hall meetings, deliberation, where you'll be able to harness the human resource and human capacity to jail them and mobilize them towards a development. It is the aggregate component of those local development at the various grassroots that takes effect at the state level and it goes to the national level. But we want to do it at the national level and for it to go down. It's not possible.
Okay, now, my apologies,
Okay.
Alero. So this leadership question thing, we're talking along the line of security in West Africa. How do you see that playing out?
It's a symptom. It's a byproduct of the lack of responsibility on the part of the rulership. What we are seeing in terms of security is a byproduct. I'm trying to use a medical term for it, but because I'm not a medical practitioner, but let me just limit it to my own terminologies. That when you see a breakdown in leadership responsibility, it's like you have a car, you have failed to service the car, you have failed to oil the car, you have failed to put gas in the car. You just jump into the car and drive over as usual. And one day the car begins to cough and it refuses to move. There are certain responsibilities. My definition of leadership at all points in time, especially in my doctoral program, is that leadership is taking responsibility. So the security question is the failure of those who are in political institutions, who are in governance, who are holding political offices. Is the lack and their failure of taking responsibility for the things that they signed, that contract, that social contract they signed with the followership. And that's why we have insecurity. It's like a child whose father is failed to take care or take responsibility for his education, for his feeding. The child is hungry. He goes into the town, he goes into the city. He sees his own colleagues going to school every morning. They can eat, they're well dressed. I drive through the traffic in Lagos. I see how those children look into the car, and I see how they look into the car looking at my children. They look, the longing in their eyes is that these children are privileged, sitting in an AC car, looking good, looking fresh. They admire it, they aspire, but sometimes they are angry. They get angry, they get frustrated, and they wonder why they don't deserve that kind of life. And they look at their father and they're asking, why is it that it's this man that gave birth to me? Why did I come into this kind of family? Why did I not? Then if that aspiration is not well guided, if that desire is not well structured, they result into crime of taking it by force. And that's why, if you are not very careful now, we see people begging on the road, begging on the street, knocking on our windows, asking us to give them money. It's a security question. They've stopped that. Right on Ogudu Road in Lagos, very close to where the Apostolic Church is, they now rob in broad daylight. I was attacked twice. Broad daylight, 12 in the afternoon. They hit on my glass so hard and told me they were going to break it down if I don't give them money because they are hungry. That is a reaction to irresponsible leadership that we have had in this country for so long. So it is not a shock that those who are in charge of the gun, it is not surprising that those who are in charge of the instrument of violence are equally frustrated, are equally maltreated, are equally not reckoned with. And we expect that we've empowered them with the gun to protect us, they will not react against us. It's like a man who brought a lion into his house as a pet and is refusing to feed the lion. The lion will wake up one day and take his children for lunch.
Of course.
And that's exactly what we are experiencing with the security situation in our country. And a lot of the security situation across West Africa is grossly underreported. It's grossly underreported. It is the shocking ones that now create a consciousness. The ones where we now have 17-year-old, 18-year-old doing ritual killings. So when you now have people in military who have the gun, who have the instrument of violence, then what can we do?
Okay, Mr. Hyson, something that Mr. Shubande said earlier, which brought to my mind the video that made the rounds some time ago, where there was a short history of the UAE showing all the marvels in the land, and where renowned talk show host and comedian Steve Harvey asked the question, who does this in 50 years? It must be leaders who have a vision and a love of their people. I would like your comment on that closing statement of Steve Harvey's.
That comes from the love for the people. And the people have the consciousness that the leadership has a love for them, that the leadership has its interest, not just the leadership's, but the followers' interest. So, like we said at the very beginning, that is a proper leadership in contract with the led that agree, that have a bilateral understanding, a consensus that here is the vision, this is the trajectory, these are the components, the dynamics within from the trajectory from when it's agreed to where the vision is. So the followers would definitely follow the leader because they know the leader has its interest, and because they're working together, they're more likely to fulfill that vision because everyone is committed to it. But where you have a leadership that has lost legitimacy, that has lost deterrence, and therefore it generates a conflict between the rulership and the people that are supposed to follow that are not following anymore because they want the leadership position. That is where then you have a problem. Why they were able to do that is because of the love for the people and the people recognizing that the leadership has a love for it and that the only way that vision can be fulfilled is by working together.
Well, Mr. Eisen, we'll start winding down now. So what would be your advice to Nigerians as they enter an election year? What kinds of questions should we be asking those who are putting themselves forward? What should we be looking for in these people who are putting themselves forward?
What is your agenda? What are you promising to do? What are the timelines? What is your plan? What are the stages?
Timelines?
What are for the stages?
Okay.
That is the question. Those are the questions you ask.
You said
and the answers have to be expressed.
You said timelines, did you?
Yes.
Okay, but sometimes they get there and they find that there isn't money to do what they promised to do. What they tell us, there isn't money.
But because I don't think there's enough transparency. I don't think there's enough accountability within the Nigerian structure. So that needs to be sorted out as well. They may tell us there's not the money, but how do we know there's not the money? How do we know if there's not enough transparency?
Okay. Mr. Shabande, what would be your advice to us as we look forward to 2023?
My advice is Nigerians should lower their expectations. 2023 is another election that will repeat itself the way other elections have been coming. My advice is Nigerians should stop breaking their own hearts. It's heartbreaking to elect and elect and elect, and we keep mobilizing to elect. So lower your expectations. You can never change Nigeria in 4 years or 8 years tenure of a governor, a president, or a councillor.
You can
so
start.
Don't let anybody come lying to you that they will change your country, they will change your state in 4 years or in 8 years. It is not true. The decadence that we have experienced in this nation has been long run for the past 20, 30 years. It will take another 20, 30 years of serious-mindedness, of accountability, of benevolent leadership, of transparency, of responsible leadership to restructure this nation. Our problem is systemic. Our problem is not only a problem of those who are in political leadership, our problem is also largely the followership as well. It's as if the followership themselves do not even want development for themselves. As bad as it is, some leaders are genuine, they are interested in governance, in doing the right thing, but the people around them are not even interested in doing the right thing. They're just there to gain, to grab, and to be self-serving. So, Nigerians, the reality is this. As you are going to the polls, it is not enough to pray and stop. We've prayed too much in this country, and that is what is killing us. So let's forget all of those. It's not because I don't believe in God. It's not because I don't believe in prayer. When you pray, correspond it with actions. The action is this. Invite your political aspirants, especially at the local level, for town hall meetings where you can question them directly.
Okay.
Ask them for their personal value system. What is their personal value system? Is that personal value system in alignment with their policies?
Thank you, Mr. Shobande. We just need to anchor it here. We've run completely out of time. Mr. Toye Shobande, strategic leadership expert and lawyer and public speaker, who joined us via Zoom, and Mr. John Eisen, lawyer and international expert on counterterrorism and conflict resolution, who also joined us via Zoom, both from the UK. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Sunrise will be back with another interesting subject in just a moment. Stay with us.